The late Roman Republic was a world teetering on the brink of monumental change. In the Mediterranean, empires and kingdoms rose and fell with unsettling speed, while the shifting tides of politics, ambition, and military conquest wove intricate webs that entangled even the most powerful leaders. It was a time when rulers were more than mere sovereigns. They were players in a game that demanded not only military might but also cunning diplomacy, sharp intelligence, and, above all, the ability to navigate the merciless currents of fate. Amidst this turbulent period stood two figures whose paths would cross in ways that would alter the course of history. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, and Artavasdes II, the king of Armenia, were separated by more than geography. They represented two different worlds, each struggling for survival in a landscape defined by Roman hegemony and the ambition of the leaders who sought to control it. Yet, despite the vast differences between them, their fates were intertwined in ways neither could have fully understood. At the heart of this conflict was Rome, a republic whose power had been expanding rapidly. The Senate and the legions that marched across the Mediterranean were at the height of their might. But beneath the surface, Rome was a republic in name only, with political infighting and personal ambition leading to instability. Julius Caesar, the great military commander, was consolidating power, carving out an empire in the east. Rome's insatiable hunger for conquest would soon reach the borders of Armenia, a kingdom wedged between the Roman world and the powerful Parthian Empire. Artavasdes II, the king of Armenia, faced this existential threat. Born into a world where survival meant playing the game of alliances, betrayal, and power dynamics, he understood that Armenia's future was not solely in his hands. As the son of Tigranes II, Artavasdes was a ruler with deep roots in the history of Armenia, a nation that had long resisted domination by outside forces. However, the rise of Rome and the expansionist ambitions of its leaders made the fragile peace Armenia had enjoyed with its neighbors increasingly untenable. Artavasdes II's reign began in 55 BC, at a time when Rome was flexing its muscles in the east, securing the loyalty of local kings, and forcing those who resisted to bend the knee. For Artavasdes, who came to the throne after the death of his father, the task ahead was monumental: to protect his kingdom from the Roman colossus while simultaneously securing the favor of powerful neighbors. Armenia, surrounded by the mighty Parthian Empire to the east and the expanding Roman Republic to the west, was caught in a delicate balance. To survive, Artavasdes had to be a master of diplomacy, a skill that would soon lead him to an unexpected and controversial relationship with Cleopatra. Cleopatra VII, the Queen of Egypt, had already proven herself to be a master of political maneuvering. Born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, Cleopatra inherited a kingdom embroiled in a series of internal struggles. But through a combination of intelligence, charm, and ruthless political calculation, she ascended to the throne, in the face of threats from both internal rivals and external enemies. Cleopatra sought alliances with the most powerful men in Rome, first with Julius Caesar and later with Mark Antony. Her beauty, wit, and political acumen made her one of the most captivating and formidable figures of the ancient world. And her relationship with Julius Caesar catapulted her to the forefront of Roman politics. But Cleopatra's ambitions did not stop at Egypt. She sought to expand her influence across the Mediterranean and, in doing so, turned her eyes eastward. Egypt's role in the region was pivotal, and Cleopatra knew that maintaining good relations with the neighboring kingdoms, especially Armenia, was essential for her survival. Armenia, with its strategic position between the Roman and Parthian spheres of influence, was a key player in Cleopatra's grand strategy. The early interactions between Artavasdes II and Cleopatra were defined by mutual interest. Cleopatra, eager to secure Armenia as an ally in her ongoing struggle to solidify Egypt's position against Roman expansion, saw Artavasdes as a valuable ally. Artavasdes, for his part, recognized the importance of Egypt in the larger political landscape and understood that securing Cleopatra's favor could provide Armenia with a shield against the encroaching power of Rome. The relationship between the two rulers was not one of immediate trust or deep affection, but rather one of political necessity. Cleopatra, ever calculating, knew that Artavasdes could be an important counterbalance to Roman power in the east. Likewise, Artavasdes saw in Cleopatra not only a potential ally but a means to strengthen his position against the growing power of Rome. Together, they made tentative moves toward a diplomatic alliance, one that could serve both their interests in an increasingly hostile and competitive world. However, Cleopatra's ambitions were far-reaching, and her alliances were not made lightly. Her political calculations were driven by one goal: the preservation and expansion of Egypt's power. To achieve this, she needed the support of Rome, and more specifically, the loyalty of Julius Caesar, the man who had helped her reclaim her throne from internal rivals. Her relationship with Caesar, both personal and political, was central to her strategy, and she was willing to make difficult decisions to secure her position. It was in this context that Artavasdes II found himself entangled in a web of alliances that would soon stretch beyond his control. The Roman Republic, ever expanding and increasingly militaristic, began to take a more direct interest in Armenia. Julius Caesar, ever the visionary, sought to strengthen Rome's hold over the East, and Armenia, sitting at the crossroads of East and West, was a key piece in his plans. The question for Artavasdes was how to navigate the growing pressure from both Rome and Cleopatra without compromising his kingdom's autonomy. This was a world where rulers had to balance competing forces: personal ambition, loyalty, military strength, and political acumen. Artavasdes, like Cleopatra, understood that survival meant constantly adapting to the shifting tides of power. The alliance between Armenia and Egypt was fragile, and both rulers were aware that they were engaged in a delicate dance, one that required careful steps to avoid a misstep that could lead to disaster. The relationship between Cleopatra and Artavasdes was marked by this uncertainty. Neither side fully trusted the other, but both understood the importance of the alliance. Yet, as Rome's influence continued to grow, and as Cleopatra's alliances with Roman generals like Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony deepened, the balance of power in the region began to shift in unexpected ways. What began as a mutual need for survival would soon evolve into a relationship defined by competition, betrayal, and ultimately, the brutal realities of power. As Artavasdes II looked toward the future of Armenia, he could not have known that the choices he made in the coming years would lead him down a path where his fate would be forever entwined with that of Cleopatra VII. The Game of Thrones, as it were, was one that neither could play without the other, and the outcome would be decided not only by their own ambitions but by the shifting tides of Roman power, Egyptian intrigue, and the delicate diplomacy of kings and queens. Cleopatra VII's story was one of both brilliance and controversy, of ambition and survival. Born in 69 BC, Cleopatra came into the world at a time when Egypt, once the jewel of the ancient world, was a shadow of its former glory. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt since the reign of Ptolemy I after Alexander the Great's death, had begun to show signs of instability. By the time Cleopatra was born, Egypt's internal struggles, political infighting, and weakened economy made the kingdom vulnerable to both internal and external threats. Cleopatra was not the firstborn child of King Ptolemy XII Auletes. But when her father's health deteriorated, she found herself in a position to claim the throne alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. In her early years as queen, Cleopatra's position was challenged by court intrigues and the shifting alliances of Egypt's nobility. As a Ptolemaic ruler, Cleopatra was bound by the tradition of co-regency, often sharing power with male members of the royal family. This led to early political strife with her brother, who was initially co-ruler with her. However, her intelligence, political acumen, and strong character would prove to be her greatest assets in the struggles that lay ahead. Cleopatra's journey toward absolute power began with her relationship with Julius Caesar, one of the most powerful men in the Roman Republic. By the time she became queen, Rome had grown into an ever-expanding empire, and its interest in Egypt had become more pronounced. The Roman Senate and generals had already begun to influence Egyptian politics, and Cleopatra understood that if Egypt were to maintain its sovereignty, she would need to align herself with Rome's most powerful figures. The opportunity came in 48 BC, when Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria during his campaign to solidify his control over Rome. Cleopatra, always resourceful, saw this as an opportunity to secure her throne and perhaps a powerful ally. According to legend, Cleopatra made her first appearance before Caesar in an unconventional manner, smuggled into the palace in a rug, which was unfurled in front of the Roman general. The moment of their meeting marked the beginning of one of the most famous political and personal alliances in history. Their relationship was immediately consequential. Cleopatra had been struggling to hold on to power in Egypt, and Caesar was looking for support for his military campaigns. In a bold and daring move, Cleopatra forged an alliance with Caesar, one that would be both political and personal. Caesar's support helped her defeat her brother Ptolemy XIII, who was backed by a faction within the Egyptian court. Soon, Cleopatra became the sole ruler of Egypt, and her relationship with Caesar solidified her grip on the throne. Beyond their personal connection, their political alliance was a force to be reckoned with. Caesar's military support helped Cleopatra secure her rule, and in return, Cleopatra worked to secure Egypt's position as a valuable ally to Rome. She recognized that her power, and Egypt's power, were increasingly dependent on Rome's favor. This was a theme that would recur throughout Cleopatra's reign: her ability to balance her own ambitions with the demands of powerful Roman figures. Cleopatra and Julius Caesar had a son together, Caesarion, born in 47 BC, and the birth of their child cemented Cleopatra's role as a central figure in Roman politics. Caesar's presence in Egypt was not just about securing Cleopatra's position. It was also about ensuring Rome's dominance in the Mediterranean. In many ways, Cleopatra was an ideal partner for Caesar. She was politically astute, and her alliance with him helped reinforce Rome's control over Egypt. Their union represented the merging of two of the greatest powers in the ancient world, Rome, the undisputed military superpower, and Egypt, the wealthiest and most enigmatic kingdom. Cleopatra's time with Caesar also deepened her understanding of Roman politics, the subtleties of power, and the game of alliances. She was no longer just the ruler of Egypt. She was a key player in the broader political landscape of the Mediterranean. This period of her life set the stage for her later relationships with other Roman leaders, particularly Mark Antony, who would play a significant role in her later years. However, the relationship between Cleopatra and Caesar was not without complications. Despite their close ties, Caesar was ultimately assassinated in 44 BC by a group of Roman senators who saw his increasing power as a threat to the Republic. His death marked a turning point in Cleopatra's life. With Caesar's death, Egypt lost its most powerful ally, and Cleopatra was left to navigate the tumultuous waters of Roman politics without the protection of the man who had once been her protector. Cleopatra's response to Caesar's assassination was swift and calculated. She returned to Egypt, where she continued to rule as queen. But her ambitions did not end with Caesar's death. Cleopatra knew that if she were to maintain Egypt's influence in the Mediterranean, she needed to align herself with another powerful Roman leader. This led her into her next major political alliance, Mark Antony. The rise of Mark Antony would play a crucial role in Cleopatra's future. Antony, a general and politician who had been one of Caesar's closest allies, became one of the most powerful men in Rome after Caesar's assassination. His ambitions for Rome's expansion in the east and his desire to challenge the growing power of Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, brought him into direct conflict with the Roman Senate and ultimately set the stage for his fateful relationship with Cleopatra. But before Antony, Cleopatra had to consolidate her position in Egypt and secure her rule. After Caesar's death, she faced several internal challenges. Egypt, despite being wealthy and culturally influential, was not immune to political instability. Cleopatra, like her predecessors, had to contend with the demands of the Egyptian elite, the priesthood, and the various factions within the court. Her reign was, at times, marked by the need to navigate complex political alliances both within Egypt and with her external neighbors. But through it all, Cleopatra's shrewdness and determination kept her in power. It was also during this period that Cleopatra began to reach out to other rulers of the eastern Mediterranean, forging new alliances to secure Egypt's future. Armenia, with its strategic position between Rome and Parthia, was one such kingdom that Cleopatra had to consider. Artavasdes II, the King of Armenia, represented a key player in this regional balance of power, and Cleopatra's interest in forging a connection with him would soon take center stage in her political plans. Cleopatra's rise to power, her relationships with powerful Roman figures, and her ability to secure Egypt's position in the Mediterranean were all part of her vision for a grand alliance that could withstand the growing pressures of Roman dominance. Little did Artavasdes II know that his fate would soon become intertwined with hers, and that their political calculations would lead to a fateful meeting that would change the course of history. Artavasdes II was not born into a world of simplicity. The history of Armenia was one of power struggles and shifting alliances. And Artavasdes' ascension to the throne of the Kingdom of Armenia in 55 BC was no different. Armenia, nestled between the Roman Republic and the Parthian Empire, was a kingdom that could neither afford to be neutral nor too aligned with any one power for too long. The political dynamics of this region were complex, and Artavasdes, born into a noble family with deep historical ties to the throne, had the arduous task of navigating this intricate web of alliances, rivalries, and territorial disputes. Born to King Tigranes II, Artavasdes was raised amidst the complexities of Armenia's long-standing struggle for independence. His father, Tigranes, had been a formidable ruler, known for expanding the Armenian Empire to its greatest territorial extent. Tigranes' reign, however, had ended in a dramatic fall when his alliance with the Parthians was undone by the Romans, culminating in his defeat by the Roman general Pompey in 66 BC. The years that followed saw Armenia's power diminish, and its kings often found themselves either bending to the will of Rome or the Parthians, or worse, being caught in the crossfire of their conflict. Artavasdes, who succeeded his father after his death, inherited not just a kingdom but a legacy of lost power and a landscape fraught with danger. His task was monumental. How could he restore Armenia's former glory while safeguarding its sovereignty from the growing Roman influence? How could he ensure Armenia remained a player in the increasingly polarized world where Rome's grip was tightening and Parthia's ambitions stretched ever farther east? Upon ascending to the throne, Artavasdes II immediately sought to stabilize his kingdom, recognizing the looming shadow of Rome to the west and the Parthian threat to the east. His first priority was to secure Armenia's borders. He was aware that Armenia's survival depended on maintaining a delicate balance between these two superpowers. The Roman Republic, led by ambitious generals like Pompey and Caesar, had proven itself a formidable force, expanding rapidly across the Mediterranean and into the east. To the east, the Parthian Empire, though weakened at times, had the potential to rise again and exert pressure on Armenia. Artavasdes understood that Armenia's survival required him to carefully play the role of mediator, aligning when necessary, but also standing firm in his independence. The first challenge Artavasdes faced was how to approach the growing influence of Rome. In an effort to navigate the delicate situation, he initially pursued diplomacy with Rome. Rome's Senate had long coveted Armenia's strategic location as a bridge between the East and West, and Artavasdes knew that staying on good terms with the Romans was necessary. However, he also knew that simply yielding to Roman demands would make Armenia a vassal state, and that was something Artavasdes was not willing to entertain. In the midst of his efforts to maintain Armenia's autonomy, Artavasdes looked beyond his borders for potential alliances. It was during this time that Egypt, under the rule of Cleopatra VII, began to make its presence known as a potential power player in the region. Cleopatra, with her complex political maneuvering and ability to maintain her kingdom's sovereignty amid Roman pressures, could offer Artavasdes a unique opportunity. While Egypt and Armenia were geographically distant, their interests in maintaining independence from Roman domination made them potential allies. Artavasdes was keenly aware of the need for strong allies who could provide both military support and diplomatic cover in case of Roman aggression. Armenia was caught in the middle of a Roman world that sought control and a Parthian empire that was always looking to expand. By allying with Cleopatra, Artavasdes could strengthen Armenia's position and ensure that his kingdom would not be swallowed by the growing Roman Empire. Cleopatra, for her part, recognized that an alliance with Armenia could benefit her in the long term. Egypt's control over the eastern Mediterranean was ever under threat, and keeping the Roman Republic at bay was one of Cleopatra's primary concerns. An alliance with Artavasdes could help both parties maintain their independence and counter the growing Roman influence. While Cleopatra's interests were undoubtedly tied to Rome, she was a skilled enough politician to understand the necessity of building a coalition of regional powers that could challenge Rome when necessary. Thus began the first interactions between Artavasdes II and Cleopatra VII. At first, their alliance was based on mutual political calculation rather than personal affection. They both sought to protect their kingdoms and maintain their independence, and their shared interest in preserving power would form the foundation of their relationship. For Artavasdes, this alliance with Cleopatra represented a potential safeguard against the encroaching Roman threat. But it also meant navigating the complexities of Egyptian diplomacy. And he was no fool. He understood that Cleopatra's alliances were often based on what was best for Egypt and her own personal interests. Artavasdes' position was precarious, as Armenia was not a power in the same league as Rome or even Parthia. His alliance with Cleopatra was a practical one, offering a counterweight to Roman aggression, but it also came with its own set of challenges. Cleopatra's close ties to Julius Caesar were undeniable, and Artavasdes had to be careful not to anger Rome in the process. But he also knew that an alliance with Egypt could offer a level of protection and leverage that Armenia might need in the coming years. In the broader context of Rome's expansion, the alliance between Armenia and Egypt was not a permanent solution. It was a temporary shield in the face of growing pressure. Still, it was a significant move for Artavasdes, one that allowed him to secure his position while he figured out how to navigate the future. He was astute enough to know that time was running out, and that soon, the balance of power in the region would shift again. For Cleopatra, the alliance with Artavasdes was a pragmatic choice. Though she had personal ambitions and was intimately connected with the politics of Rome, she understood the value of strengthening Egypt's position in the East. Artavasdes was a crucial piece in her strategy to maintain Egypt's independence, especially as she struggled to maintain her place in the Roman world. With the rise of Julius Caesar's political influence, Cleopatra had already begun to navigate the intricacies of Roman alliances, but she also saw in Armenia a potential partner who could help create a more complex web of alliances in the region. Thus, the foundation of the alliance between Artavasdes II and Cleopatra was set. The two rulers, both keenly aware of the delicate balance of power that defined their respective worlds, began to tread carefully toward a future shaped by mutual benefit, an alliance that would ultimately come to have profound consequences for both Armenia and Egypt. However, neither of them knew that their alliance, born of necessity and political calculation, would soon face challenges that neither party could have anticipated. The political landscape of the ancient world was one where every alliance, every diplomatic gesture, and every whispered conversation could be the turning point for kingdoms. The delicate balance that Artavasdes II and Cleopatra VII sought to maintain between Armenia and Egypt was no simple matter. In this volatile world, alliances were fragile, and neither ruler could afford to be too trusting. The early encounters between Armenia and Egypt, marked by cautious steps toward cooperation, set the stage for a relationship that would come to be defined by ambition, shifting power dynamics, and ultimately, betrayal. For Artavasdes II, the alliance with Cleopatra, though valuable, was fraught with uncertainty. Armenia, a small kingdom by comparison to the Roman Republic and Parthian Empire, was caught between two giant powers, Rome and Parthia. The Roman Republic's dominance was undeniable. Their legions had marched across the Mediterranean, and their influence stretched deep into the east. Artavasdes knew that while Cleopatra was a powerful ally, aligning too closely with her, especially in the eyes of Rome, could risk provoking the wrath of the Republic. However, Armenia's survival depended on a delicate balance, neither fully siding with Rome nor standing against it. Cleopatra, for her part, was no stranger to playing the political game. In fact, she had mastered it. The alliance with Artavasdes was not an act of friendship, but rather a strategic move to safeguard Egypt's interests. As the last queen of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Cleopatra understood the fragility of her kingdom's position. Egypt was rich, fertile, and powerful in its own right, but it was also strategically vulnerable, sitting between the expanding Roman Republic and the increasingly ambitious Parthian Empire. Her own survival, and that of Egypt, depended on maintaining strong relationships with the key powers of the Mediterranean and Near East. Her alliance with Julius Caesar had already proven invaluable, but Caesar's death in 44 BC had thrown the delicate balance of power in Rome into turmoil. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, had to shift her focus, not just to ensure Egypt's stability, but to secure her own future. With the rise of Mark Antony, another powerful Roman figure, she saw an opportunity to continue the fragile web of alliances that had kept Egypt afloat. The relationship between Cleopatra and Antony would define the next phase of her reign. But it would also have far-reaching implications for Armenia. In the early days of their diplomatic relationship, Artavasdes was cautious, though open to the possibility of cooperation. His initial meetings with Cleopatra were likely to have been centered on shared interests, the desire to protect their respective kingdoms from the overreach of Rome and the Parthian Empire. The idea of an alliance between Armenia and Egypt, even if tenuous, represented a significant diplomatic maneuver in a world where allegiances shifted with the winds of power. Artavasdes, aware of Cleopatra's keen political mind, was careful to tread lightly. He knew that any alliance with Egypt could draw the unwanted attention of Rome, and his kingdom could not afford that kind of risk. The early discussions between the two monarchs may have revolved around their mutual understanding of the Roman threat. Both knew that Rome's expansionism would not stop at Armenia or Egypt, but would eventually seek to swallow both. Egypt had already suffered the consequences of Roman interference under the reign of Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII. After his death, Cleopatra had found herself fighting for her life and her throne against internal and external threats, including the rising influence of Rome. Armenia had seen similar pressures from Rome, with the Romans seeking to influence the region through their allies and client kings. For both Artavasdes and Cleopatra, the threat was clear. Rome's growing power could be the end of their independence. But alliances in the ancient world were never simple, even as they began to discuss the possibility of a formal alliance. Both rulers knew that the price of such a relationship could be steep. Cleopatra's connections to Julius Caesar had given Egypt an undeniable advantage in the Mediterranean. But Caesar's death had created a power vacuum, one that could easily be filled by the rising star of Mark Antony. Meanwhile, Artavasdes was facing his own challenges. While the alliance with Cleopatra could provide a temporary shield, it did not solve Armenia's long-term problems. Armenia's vulnerability to Roman influence remained, and Artavasdes had no illusion that Egypt alone could protect his kingdom from Rome's ambitions. As Artavasdes traveled to Alexandria to meet Cleopatra, the complexities of their relationship began to unfold. It was clear that while the alliance was based on mutual need, it was also defined by careful negotiation and strategic positioning. Cleopatra, ever the savvy diplomat, sought to secure Artavasdes as an ally, knowing that Armenia's position could provide Egypt with a valuable counterweight against Roman ambitions. Artavasdes, on the other hand, sought to ensure that any alliance with Cleopatra would not come at the cost of Armenia's sovereignty. He was not interested in becoming a puppet state of Egypt, as many other kingdoms in the region had fallen victim to Roman influence. The meeting between Artavasdes and Cleopatra was likely one of intense discussions, with both rulers testing each other's resolve and commitment. Artavasdes, for all his political acumen, was no match for Cleopatra in terms of sheer diplomatic finesse. She was a ruler who had learned to balance the power of Rome with the need to preserve Egypt's independence. And she had mastered the art of negotiation. Her relationship with Julius Caesar had shown her the importance of aligning with the most powerful Roman figures. But it also had shown her the risks involved in such alliances. Cleopatra understood that Artavasdes was a king who could not afford to make rash decisions. Armenia was geographically positioned between the Roman Republic and the Parthian Empire, and Artavasdes had to play both sides carefully. His kingdom's survival depended on his ability to make tactical alliances, without allowing himself to be drawn too deeply into the conflicts that surrounded him. At the same time, Cleopatra knew that a successful alliance with Armenia could give her an important diplomatic edge against the growing power of Rome. Yet, even as they discussed the potential benefits of their alliance, there was a subtle tension between the two rulers. Artavasdes, who had spent his life navigating the treacherous politics of the Caucasus, knew that Cleopatra was not a ruler who made alliances out of friendship alone. She was calculating and focused on Egypt's survival above all else. He had to be wary of her ambitions, just as she had to be cautious about his. Both leaders understood the risks involved in a deeper alliance, and both were aware that their relationship, if not handled delicately, could lead to betrayal. Cleopatra's desire to maintain Egypt's power in the region was matched only by her need to ensure that her relationships with Roman leaders like Mark Antony would continue to be strong. The growing tension between Antony and Octavian, the future Augustus, created a volatile environment. Cleopatra's alliances with Roman figures were always contingent on the changing tides of Roman politics. For Artavasdes, this meant that any alliance with Cleopatra was inherently unstable. It would take little for the fragile balance between Armenia and Egypt to be upset. And both rulers knew that such a shift could have devastating consequences for their respective kingdoms. In the end, the first encounters between Artavasdes II and Cleopatra were defined by mutual respect, but also by an underlying distrust. Neither ruler fully trusted the other, and yet both understood the value of the alliance. Armenia's future depended on strategic alliances, and Egypt, with its wealth and power, could provide a necessary counterbalance to the growing threat of Rome. But Artavasdes' position was precarious. He had to tread carefully between Rome and Egypt, all while maintaining Armenia's sovereignty. As their relationship developed, Cleopatra and Artavasdes began to realize that the political game they were playing was not one that could be won with mere diplomacy. Power, in the ancient world, was often defined by military might and the willingness to act decisively. The tension between the two kingdoms, though not immediately apparent, would grow as time passed. The alliance between Armenia and Egypt would be tested in the years to come, and the consequences of any failure to uphold their promises would be felt across the region. The political winds in Rome were shifting, and Julius Caesar was at the heart of the storm. A man of immense ambition and unyielding will, Caesar had spent his life climbing the political ladder of the Roman Republic. Through military conquests, strategic alliances, and his unmatched ability to inspire loyalty, Caesar had become a force to be reckoned with, not only in Rome but across the known world. His relationship with Cleopatra was not merely a personal affair, but a carefully calculated alliance that would have far-reaching consequences for both Egypt and Rome, as well as for the Kingdom of Armenia. Cleopatra's decision to align herself with Julius Caesar was not an act of love, at least not in the conventional sense. While Caesar and Cleopatra certainly shared a personal connection, one that would result in the birth of a son, Caesarion, Cleopatra was shrewd enough to understand that their alliance was much more significant than any romance. Egypt, once a powerful kingdom in its own right, was now precariously situated between two great empires, the Roman Republic and the Parthian Empire. Her father, Ptolemy XII, had been forced to submit to Roman demands, and Cleopatra herself had been exiled from Egypt in a bitter power struggle against her brother, Ptolemy XIII. By the time Caesar arrived in Egypt in 48 BC, Cleopatra was already on the verge of losing her kingdom. Her brother's forces had ousted her from the throne, and her life was in danger. At this critical juncture, she had no choice but to seek the support of the most powerful man in the world, Julius Caesar. Caesar's arrival in Alexandria was the beginning of a new chapter for Cleopatra, one that would reshape her destiny and, ultimately, the future of Egypt. Despite the potential risks of aligning herself with a Roman general, Cleopatra saw in Caesar a path to reclaim her throne. But this was not an alliance born of desperation alone. It was a calculated move that would allow Cleopatra to wield Roman power for her own benefit. By securing Caesar's support, Cleopatra not only regained her throne but also gained a powerful ally in the heart of the Roman Republic. The relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra was complex and multifaceted. On the surface, it was an alliance of convenience, forged in the crucible of political necessity. Caesar, for his part, saw in Cleopatra a means of consolidating Roman influence over Egypt, a region that was both wealthy and strategically important, as Egypt was one of Rome's chief allies in the eastern Mediterranean. It was vital that Caesar maintain its loyalty. For Cleopatra, the relationship was a means of ensuring the survival of her dynasty and restoring Egypt's power and influence in the region. While their relationship was undoubtedly political, it was also deeply personal. Caesar, known for his many liaisons with powerful women throughout his career, found in Cleopatra a partner who matched his intellect and ambition. The Egyptian queen, whose beauty and intelligence had captivated many before Caesar, was more than just a monarch, she was a ruler in her own right. With a vision for Egypt's future that aligned closely with Caesar's own ambitions, the two shared a mutual respect, if not a deep emotional connection. And together, they began to shape the future of both Egypt and Rome. In 47 BC, Cleopatra and Caesar's alliance was further solidified with the birth of their son, Caesarion. The child's birth symbolized not just a personal connection between the two leaders but a dynastic one. By having a son with Cleopatra, Caesar ensured that Egypt would remain firmly under his influence. And he made it clear to the Roman Senate that Egypt was now an ally that could not be ignored. The birth of Caesarion was not just a political statement, it was an acknowledgement of the union between Rome and Egypt. A union that would serve both sides' interests for years to come. For Cleopatra, the birth of Caesarion was also a victory. The child would serve as a living symbol of her relationship with Caesar, and as her son, he would inherit both the throne of Egypt and a connection to Rome. Cleopatra's hopes were high. By aligning herself with Caesar, she had ensured that Egypt would no longer be a pawn in the game of Roman politics but would be a respected and powerful partner. The child, Caesarion, was not only a political asset but a key to Egypt's continued survival and influence in the face of growing Roman power. But as much as the alliance with Caesar benefited Cleopatra and Egypt, it also had implications for the broader Mediterranean world. Rome, now deeply involved in the politics of Egypt, found itself with an ally in the east that could help secure its interests against the rising Parthian threat. Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra was not just about personal gain, it was about securing Roman power in a region that was critical to Rome's continued dominance. However, the alliance was also fraught with dangers. Caesar's involvement in Egypt and his growing connection to Cleopatra did not go unnoticed by his political enemies in Rome. The Roman Senate, long suspicious of Caesar's ambitions, saw his relationship with Cleopatra as yet another sign of his growing power and his willingness to interfere in the affairs of foreign kingdoms. Many senators, already wary of Caesar's increasing control over Rome, viewed his alliance with Cleopatra as a further consolidation of his influence. The fact that Caesar had fathered a son with the Queen of Egypt only added fuel to the fire, raising concerns about his intentions and the future of Roman politics. In 44 BC, Caesar's life was cut short by the infamous Ides of March, when a group of Roman senators, led by Brutus and Cassius, assassinated him in a bid to restore the power of the Senate and curb Caesar's growing influence. His death sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world, and the political landscape of Rome was thrown into disarray. Cleopatra, who had forged such a strong alliance with Caesar, was left to navigate the uncertain waters of Roman politics without her greatest protector. Despite the danger posed by Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra remained resolute. She quickly returned to Egypt, where she continued to rule with an iron fist, determined to protect her kingdom and the legacy she had built with Caesar. However, the political vacuum left by Caesar's death did not go unnoticed. Mark Antony, one of Caesar's most trusted generals, began to rise to power, positioning himself as Caesar's rightful successor and consolidating his influence in the Roman world. It was during this period that Cleopatra's relationship with Mark Antony began to take shape. Antony, like Caesar before him, was a man of ambition and military prowess. His rise to power in Rome mirrored that of Caesar, and Cleopatra, ever the political strategist, saw in Antony an opportunity to continue her alliance with Rome. In 41 BC, Cleopatra traveled to Tarsus to meet Antony, and their meeting would change the course of history. Their relationship, much like Cleopatra's earlier alliance with Caesar, was both personal and political. For Antony, the alliance with Cleopatra was an opportunity to secure Egypt's support in his struggles for power in Rome. For Cleopatra, the relationship with Antony was a way to continue Egypt's strong ties with Rome and ensure the survival of her dynasty. But as with all alliances, it was not without complications. Cleopatra's relationship with Antony would lead to political tension between Antony and Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. setting the stage for a bitter civil war that would ultimately result in the downfall of both Antony and Cleopatra. In the years following Caesar's death, Cleopatra's position in the Mediterranean world continued to be defined by her relationship with Rome. While she had lost her greatest ally, she had learned how to navigate the treacherous waters of Roman politics. Her alliances with Caesar and later with Antony cemented her place as one of the most powerful women in history. And her ability to manipulate the politics of both Rome and Egypt ensured that her legacy would endure for centuries. Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar had fundamentally altered the trajectory of Egypt and its role in the Mediterranean world. Through their alliance, Cleopatra had secured Egypt's independence, restored her dynasty, and cemented her position as one of the most formidable political figures of her time. However, as the years passed and the political landscape shifted, Cleopatra's relationships with Rome would face new challenges, and her ability to maintain Egypt's sovereignty would be put to the test once more. Cleopatra VII was a ruler who understood the subtle art of power as few others did. She knew that survival in the ancient world, particularly in her position as the queen of a kingdom perched between powerful empires, required more than just military might. It demanded the ability to read the shifting tides of political alliances and to act decisively when opportunities arose. It was in this political climate that Cleopatra began to focus on Artavasdes II, the King of Armenia, a realm that lay between the expanding forces of Rome and Parthia. The Kingdom of Armenia was a powerful player in the east, but it was also one that found itself perpetually caught between two formidable neighbors, Rome and Parthia. Artavasdes, a wise and cautious ruler, understood this better than most. As a king, he had the daunting task of preserving Armenia's sovereignty while also maintaining cordial relationships with two of the most powerful states of his time. The challenges were considerable, but the rewards were even greater if he could maneuver carefully. In this delicate game, Artavasdes saw an opportunity to forge an alliance with Cleopatra, whose ambitions were as vast as the kingdom she ruled. The power dynamics of the ancient world were often shaped by the relationships between rulers and the shifting allegiances between states. Cleopatra, ever the astute strategist, had already formed a close relationship with Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome. Through her alliance with Caesar, Egypt had regained its independence and had even prospered. But with Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, the political landscape of Rome was thrown into turmoil. The void left by Caesar's death was filled by two major figures, Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted lieutenant, and Octavian, his adopted heir and the future Augustus. Both men were vying for control of the Roman world, and Cleopatra saw in their struggle an opportunity to position herself and Egypt as powerful players in this new Roman order. At the same time, Artavasdes II faced the ongoing threat of Roman expansion. While the Parthians to the east were a significant concern, Rome's steady march toward dominance in the east was a pressing issue that demanded Artavasdes' attention. The Armenian king could not afford to ignore the growing Roman power, especially as the Republic seemed intent on making vassals of the lesser kingdoms around it. Artavasdes, therefore, needed to strengthen his position, both diplomatically and militarily. This was where Cleopatra's influence came into play. For Cleopatra, securing an alliance with Artavasdes would not only strengthen Egypt's position in the east, but it would also provide a useful counterweight against Roman expansion. She knew that Armenia's strategic location, situated as it was between the Roman and Parthian empires, could be of great importance. If Artavasdes could be kept as an ally, Egypt would have a much-needed ally in the region to help balance the Roman presence. But while the political calculus was clear, the relationship between Cleopatra and Artavasdes was not a simple one. Artavasdes, ever cautious, was not easily swayed by the promises of distant rulers. He had already learned from bitter experience that alliances could be fragile and that the fates of kings were often decided by their ability to read the changing political tides. While Artavasdes might have seen the potential benefits of an alliance with Egypt, he was also wary of becoming too entangled in the affairs of the Roman Republic, which was expanding at an alarming rate. Furthermore, he knew that Cleopatra's interests were deeply tied to her relationship with Rome. She had already aligned herself with Julius Caesar, and now she was forging connections with Mark Antony. For Artavasdes, This could be a blessing or a curse. The Armenian king understood that Cleopatra's political allegiances were always fluid, shifting with the winds of Roman power. She was aligned with Caesar during his lifetime, but Caesar's death had precipitated a change in her strategies. Now, with the rise of Antony and the growing tension between Antony and Octavian, Cleopatra had to navigate a complex political web. Artavasdes, for his part, had little interest in becoming a pawn in this game. His desire was simple. He wanted to preserve Armenia's independence and strengthen its position in the world. But he also recognized that aligning himself with a powerful queen like Cleopatra could offer Armenia valuable protection against the relentless expansion of Rome. The discussions between Artavasdes and Cleopatra likely revolved around the concept of mutual benefit. Artavasdes, being a ruler with a deep understanding of diplomacy, would have approached these talks with caution. He was a realist, fully aware that any alliance with Egypt would need to be carefully negotiated, and that it should not come at the cost of Armenia's sovereignty. Cleopatra, for her part, knew that she could offer Artavasdes something that Rome could not, a sense of security and a guarantee that Armenia's independence would not be compromised by Roman expansion. But she also knew that such an alliance could be fragile. Artavasdes was no fool. He understood the volatile nature of Roman politics and was wary of aligning too closely with Egypt. Given Cleopatra's shifting loyalties, the first formal talks between Cleopatra and Artavasdes may have been diplomatic in nature. But beneath the surface, there was a shared understanding of the precariousness of their positions. For Artavasdes, the alliance with Egypt represented a temporary measure, a way to secure Armenia's position while waiting for the dust to settle in Rome. He knew that he could not rely solely on Egypt for protection, and that at some point, Armenia would have to come to terms with Rome directly. But for now, the alliance with Cleopatra seemed to offer a viable option for maintaining Armenia's independence. Cleopatra, meanwhile, was playing her own game. She knew that Artavasdes, despite his caution, could be a valuable ally. The Armenian king's position between Rome and Parthia gave him a unique advantage in the region, and Egypt could benefit from having such an ally in place. But Cleopatra's real goal was to position herself as the dominant power in the East. Her relationships with both Caesar and Antony had given her a foothold in Roman politics, and she intended to use that influence to secure Egypt's position as a leading power in the Mediterranean. If she could win over Artavasdes, she would not only secure Armenia's loyalty but also strengthen Egypt's hand in the increasingly complex game of Roman politics. But even as Cleopatra worked to solidify her alliance with Artavasdes, the political dynamics in Rome were shifting. Mark Antony's rise to power had created a new set of challenges for Cleopatra. While Artavasdes may have seen Cleopatra as an ally, he was also watching the growing rivalry between Antony and Octavian with great interest. The outcome of their power struggle would have profound implications for Armenia, and Artavasdes knew that he had to be ready to adjust his alliances based on the shifting balance of power. As Artavasdes and Cleopatra worked to strengthen their political ties, it was clear that both rulers understood the fragile nature of their alliance. The changing political landscape of the Mediterranean and the rise of new Roman power centers meant that neither Artavasdes nor Cleopatra could afford to place all their trust in each other. But for now, their shared interests in maintaining independence from Rome and securing their kingdom's positions in the East gave them a common cause. Whether this alliance would survive the tumultuous political environment of the ancient world was uncertain. But for the time being, it seemed to offer both rulers a degree of protection and leverage in their ongoing struggles. In the end, Cleopatra's influence over Artavasdes was not just political, it was a reflection of the way in which power was negotiated in the ancient world. Both rulers understood the importance of maintaining strategic alliances, but they also knew that such alliances could easily be undone. Cleopatra, for her part, had the experience and the political savvy to navigate these treacherous waters. But Artavasdes, ever cautious, remained wary of becoming too closely involved in her complex political calculations. Thus, the shifting balance between Armenia and Egypt, marked by cautious diplomacy and mutual interest, would serve as a foundation for the political struggles that lay ahead. The relationship between Artavasdes and Cleopatra, while beneficial in the short term, would ultimately be tested by the growing pressure of Roman power and the ambitions of the leaders who sought to dominate the Mediterranean world. The rise of Mark Antony in the wake of Julius Caesar's assassination marked a new chapter in Roman politics. While Caesar's death had created a power vacuum in Rome, it was clear that his closest allies were poised to step into his shoes. Among these, Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted lieutenant, stood as the most powerful. Known for his military prowess, charisma, and loyalty to Caesar, Antony soon became one of the most prominent figures in Rome, though his path to power was fraught with both political and military challenges. For Cleopatra, Antony's rise presented both an opportunity and a complication. While she had once been closely allied with Caesar, the political landscape had changed dramatically since his death. Caesar's assassination had thrown Rome into chaos, and the two men who would vie for ultimate control over the Republic were Antony and Octavian. Caesar's adopted heir, Cleopatra, ever the keen strategist, understood that the outcome of the conflict between these two men would shape her future, and the future of Egypt, for years to come. Antony was a man of great ambition and considerable talent. As a general, he had proven his worth in countless battles. And as a politician, he had the connections and the influence to challenge Octavian's growing power. He was known for his ability to inspire loyalty among his troops and for his formidable presence on the battlefield. But as Rome's internal conflict raged on, Antony's military victories could only take him so far. To secure his position in Rome, Antony needed more than just military strength, he needed political allies. And in this quest, his relationship with Cleopatra was vital. Cleopatra, understanding the shifting tides of Roman politics, saw in Antony not just a potential partner but a powerful ally who could help her secure Egypt's future. After all, Antony, like Caesar before him, had the potential to offer Egypt not only protection but influence in the Mediterranean world. For Cleopatra, the choice to align herself with Antony was a logical one. He was the man most likely to carry on Caesar's vision for Roman dominance in the East. And in aligning with him, she could protect Egypt from the growing power of Rome's other leading figure, Octavian. Antony's interest in Cleopatra was, on one level, personal. Their first meeting in Tarsus in 41 BC was marked by an extravagant display of both political savvy and romantic intrigue. Cleopatra, ever the tactician, made sure her arrival was nothing short of spectacular. Draped in royal robes, Cleopatra sailed up the river Cydnus on a luxurious barge, her oarsmen adorned in gold, the sails emblazoned with purple and silver. The sight of the Egyptian queen, both powerful and enchanting, left an indelible mark on Antony, who, while initially focused on his military campaign, soon found himself captivated by Cleopatra's beauty, intelligence, and ambition. But the relationship between Antony and Cleopatra was far more than just a personal connection. For both of them, it was a political alliance, one that held the potential to reshape the future of the Mediterranean world. Cleopatra was not a woman to be easily swayed by affection alone. Her relationship with Antony was driven by necessity. By aligning herself with the powerful Roman general, she could secure her place in the new political landscape of Rome and protect Egypt's interests. In return, Antony found in Cleopatra not just a lover, but a powerful ally who could help him secure the eastern provinces of the Roman Republic, which were crucial to his political ambitions. The political implications of their union were enormous. Cleopatra's alliance with Antony gave him access to Egypt's wealth, resources, and strategic location in the Mediterranean. Egypt, rich in grain and gold, was a vital asset in the struggle for control over Rome's eastern territories. Antony, with Cleopatra's support, could strengthen his position against Octavian, whose growing influence in Rome threatened to overshadow Antony's ambitions. But as much as Cleopatra's relationship with Antony seemed like a natural alliance, it was not without its dangers. Octavian, Antony's rival and Caesar's adopted son, viewed their union with suspicion. The Romans, ever watchful of their leader's power, saw Antony's relationship with Cleopatra as a threat to the Republic's stability. Octavian used this alliance to fuel his own political propaganda, portraying Antony as a traitor to Rome, an Eastern puppet who had been seduced by the charms of a foreign queen. The stakes of the conflict between Antony and Octavian could not have been higher. The fate of Rome, and that of the entire Mediterranean world, rested on the outcome of their power struggle. For Cleopatra, this battle was just as much about Egypt's survival as it was about securing her position as a ruler in the Roman-dominated world. She knew that an Antony victory would ensure Egypt's power and influence in the east. But a defeat would spell disaster for her reign. As the conflict between Antony and Octavian grew more intense, the alliance between Cleopatra and Antony became increasingly central to the future of the ancient world. The two leaders, despite their personal connection, were now bound by the same political interests. Cleopatra's strategic calculations and Antony's military campaigns would determine the fate of Rome's eastern territories and the future of Egypt itself. In 42 BC, the conflict between Antony and Octavian reached a boiling point, culminating in the Battle of Philippi. Antony and Octavian, once allies in their struggle against Caesar's assassins, now faced each other in a bitter rivalry. The outcome of the battle would determine who would control Rome, and by extension, who would control the fate of Egypt. Cleopatra, watching from the sidelines, knew that the outcome of this battle would determine not only the fate of Antony but the fate of her kingdom as well. The battle was a devastating blow to Antony. Despite his best efforts, he and his forces were defeated by Octavian's legions. Antony's forces were crushed, and with the defeat came the erosion of his political power. For Cleopatra, the defeat at Philippi was a turning point. With Antony's position weakening, she knew that her alliance with him would soon be tested to the limit. But Cleopatra was no stranger to adversity. As a ruler, she had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of Roman politics, and the defeat at Philippi would only strengthen her resolve. The loss at Philippi, while a setback for Antony, was not the end of their ambitions. Cleopatra had always believed that, in the face of adversity, one must be prepared to fight for survival, and fight she would. Over the next several years, Antony's fortunes continued to rise and fall. His rivalry with Octavian escalated, and Cleopatra's support for Antony remained a crucial component of his struggle. Together, they would face further battles, both on the battlefield and in the political arena. As the power struggle between Antony and Octavian reached its climax, Cleopatra's involvement in Antony's campaigns was not simply as a supportive partner. She was a strategic player in her own right. Her resources, military support, and wealth were crucial in supporting Antony's ambitions. But in this political dance, Cleopatra knew that her own future was tied to Antony's success. The stakes were higher than ever, and the outcome of their alliance would have far-reaching consequences for the future of Egypt and the Mediterranean world. As Antony's campaign against Octavian continued, Cleopatra remained by his side, unwavering in her support. Together, they formed an alliance that, for a time, seemed unbreakable. But as Octavian's power continued to grow and Antony's forces weakened, Cleopatra knew that the balance of power was shifting. The outcome of this great political struggle would ultimately decide the fate of both Rome and Egypt. The political landscape of the Mediterranean had become increasingly volatile, and with every passing year, the alliance between Cleopatra and Mark Antony was under greater strain. Their once strong bond, born out of mutual interest and political necessity, was now faltering, and the fragile balance they had fought so hard to maintain was beginning to unravel. The downfall of their alliance began with the growing tension between Antony and Octavian. What was once a collaborative relationship, built on shared goals and military strategy, had long since soured into a bitter rivalry. While Cleopatra had always been astute enough to realize that alliances with Roman leaders were rarely stable, she also knew that her best chance to preserve Egypt's power and independence lay with Antony. At first, the advantages of their partnership had been clear. Antony's military prowess and Cleopatra's resources created a formidable force. Together, they had planned to carve out their share of influence in the Roman world, to protect Egypt from the growing shadow of Roman imperialism, and to secure their legacies in the eastern Mediterranean. But things began to change when Antony's actions increasingly alienated his Roman allies. Particularly Octavian, Julius Caesar's adopted son. The political situation in Rome had become a battleground, and Antony's relationships with Cleopatra, as well as his shift of focus to the east, had given Octavian all the ammunition he needed to attack his rival. Propaganda from Octavian painted Antony not only as a traitor to Rome but also as a man who had been completely enchanted by Cleopatra, reducing him to the status of a puppet king in the eyes of the Romans. His deepening relationship with the Egyptian queen, a foreign ruler who was widely viewed with suspicion in Rome, added fuel to the fire. Octavian exploited the idea that Antony had abandoned his Roman identity, aligning himself too closely with Cleopatra and, worse yet, seemingly forgetting his duties to the Republic. Cleopatra, for her part, had always been a pragmatist. She knew that Antony's rivalry with Octavian could not be avoided forever. But she had hoped that the military support and strategic alliance they had forged would be enough to outlast the political storm. Unfortunately, she could not have foreseen just how destructive the propaganda war would become. Octavian's ability to sway public opinion in Rome was unmatched, and the Senate's opposition to Antony was quickly gaining ground. Cleopatra, seeing that Antony's power base in Rome was slipping, could not afford to stand by and watch as he lost support. Yet, as much as she wanted to help Antony, there was little she could do to reverse the tide of Roman politics. The final rupture between Cleopatra and Antony came after the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. A defining moment that would change the fate of the ancient world. Leading up to this battle, both Antony and Cleopatra had gathered their forces, preparing to face Octavian's legions in what was destined to be a decisive confrontation for control of the Mediterranean world. Antony, with Cleopatra's support, brought together a fleet and an army, hoping to defeat Octavian's forces and secure the future of their alliance. But as the battle unfolded, it became clear that the alliance's frailty was more significant than ever. In the midst of the naval conflict at Actium, Cleopatra's forces, led by her, fled the battlefield. Her retreat with her fleet was disastrous for Antony, who was left exposed and demoralized by the loss. The loss of the battle not only marked the physical defeat of Antony's forces but also symbolized the disintegration of his political and military power. Cleopatra's decision to retreat at Actium has been the subject of much debate. Some argue that her flight was driven by a strategic decision, an attempt to save Egypt from certain destruction. Others suggest that her departure from the battle was a sign of the weakening alliance between her and Antony. Regardless of the exact reason, the consequences of the retreat were undeniable. It left Antony vulnerable, and with his defeat, the support from his Roman legions began to crumble. The cracks in their alliance were now visible to all, and the political world saw Cleopatra's actions as the final straw. Antony's position had always been precarious, but now it was completely compromised. With his forces routed at Actium, Antony was forced to retreat to Egypt. In Rome, Octavian seized the opportunity to solidify his grip on power. Antony's once loyal soldiers began defecting to Octavian, and the momentum shifted decisively in favor of Caesar's heir. What had once been a shared dream of dominating the East was now shattered, and Antony's prospects grew dimmer by the day. In Egypt, Cleopatra tried to salvage what was left of their power. She continued to support Antony, though their relationship was now fraught with tension. Antony's military reputation had been irreparably damaged, and with the loss at Actium, the political climate in Rome had turned decisively against him. Cleopatra, whose kingdom was deeply tied to Antony's fate, was now at risk of losing everything she had worked for. Despite her best efforts to hold on to her kingdom's stability, Cleopatra could not prevent the inevitable. Octavian's forces soon marched toward Alexandria, the heart of Cleopatra's power. With the Roman legions closing in, Antony's once proud army was reduced to nothing more than a fragmented and defeated force. The end was near. When Octavian arrived in Egypt, the situation grew dire. Antony, already in poor health, heard the news of his impending defeat and, in a final act of desperation, took his own life. Cleopatra, witnessing Antony's downfall, now faced the harsh reality that her reign in Egypt was coming to an end. She had fought so hard for Egypt's independence and for her position as queen. But her alliance with Antony had ultimately brought ruin to both of them. In her final moments, Cleopatra was not a broken queen, but a ruler who had fought for her survival until the end. She knew that with Antony's death and Octavian's victory, Egypt's days as an independent kingdom were numbered. to preserve her dignity and avoid the humiliation of being paraded through Rome as a captive. Cleopatra chose to take her own life. Alongside her, her most loyal attendants chose to follow their queen in death. Cleopatra's suicide marked the end of an era. Egypt, once a beacon of power and culture in the ancient world, became a province of the Roman Empire. With her death, Octavian secured control over Egypt and its vast wealth, and his triumph in the East marked the final consolidation of Roman power across the Mediterranean. It also marked the final collapse of the alliance between Cleopatra and Antony. An alliance that had once seemed to promise a new order in the East but had ultimately fallen victim to the shifting currents of Roman politics. The fall of Cleopatra and Antony was not just the fall of two rulers. It was the fall of a vision for a new balance of power in the Mediterranean. Their ambition, once bound together by shared dreams of expansion and influence, had ended in tragedy, but their deaths would serve as a lesson to future generations. In the world of ancient politics, alliances were fragile, and the tides of power could turn at a moment's notice. For Artavasdes II, the fall of Cleopatra and Antony marked the end of a long and complicated relationship. Armenia, once a potential player in the eastern Mediterranean, now found itself caught in the crushing grip of Rome. The Armenian king's cautious diplomacy, which had once sought to align with Egypt for mutual benefit, now faced the reality of Roman dominance. Artavasdes, like many others before him, would soon learn that Rome's shadow was inescapable, and that survival in such a world required more than just alliances. It required the strength to stand alone. The loss of Cleopatra and Antony marked a significant turning point, not only for Egypt but for the entire Mediterranean world. With Octavian's consolidation of power, the political map shifted, and the fate of kingdoms that once resisted Rome now hung in the balance. Armenia, under the cautious reign of Artavasdes II, found itself grappling with the changing tides of power, and the fate of its king was about to be sealed by the shifting allegiances in Rome. Artavasdes II, despite his diplomatic acumen, had never been naive enough to ignore the looming power of Rome. He had sought, throughout his reign, to balance his kingdom between the rival forces of the Roman Republic and the Parthian Empire. In his attempts to do so, he had entered into an alliance with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, whose own relationship with Caesar and later with Antony had seemed to promise a potential counterweight to Rome's growing dominance in the East. But with the fall of Cleopatra, Artavasdes' position became increasingly precarious. The political landscape had dramatically changed, and with the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra, the fate of Armenia rested in the hands of the new master of the Mediterranean, Octavian. Artavasdes, who had once carefully navigated the treacherous waters of diplomacy, found himself facing a reality that he could no longer avoid. His former allies were gone, and Rome's victory left him with few options. The Armenian king, known for his intelligence and military acumen, now had to decide how to play the hand that he had been dealt. However, the choice was never truly his. The weight of Rome's power pressed down on Armenia, and resistance was not an option. As soon as Octavian's forces secured control over Egypt, his focus turned eastward, to the remnants of Antony and Cleopatra's influence. Armenia, a key ally of Cleopatra's in the region, was now a target. Artavasdes, whose alliance with Egypt had been a symbol of defiance against Roman domination, had outlived its usefulness in the eyes of the Roman emperor. Octavian was not a man to tolerate any opposition, particularly from a small but strategically important kingdom like Armenia. Artavasdes' fate was now sealed by his previous association with Cleopatra and his kingdom's continued resistance to Roman supremacy. Rome's expansionist drive left Artavasdes with no room to maneuver. Desperate to maintain his kingdom's sovereignty and fearing the consequences of outright defiance, Artavasdes had hoped to delay the inevitable, seeking some form of negotiation or appeasement. But Octavian, whose political genius lay not just in military might but in his ability to manipulate his enemies, was already steps ahead. Rather than offer Artavasdes a chance to come to terms, Octavian sought to eliminate him as a potential threat. And so the king of Armenia's fate was sealed. In 34 BC, Artavasdes was betrayed. The exact details of his capture remain murky. but it is likely that his own court had been infiltrated by Roman sympathizers who had been working behind the scenes to undermine his rule. The collapse of his alliances and the weakening of his political position left him vulnerable to internal betrayals. Whether it was through an arranged ambush or a deceitful plot within his own ranks. Artavasdes was captured and brought to the Roman camp. For the Armenian king, this was the culmination of years of careful diplomacy undone by the changing tides of power. His alliance with Cleopatra, which had once seemed so promising, had become a death sentence. By aligning himself with Cleopatra, Artavasdes had earned Rome's ire, and his refusal to submit to Roman rule had sealed his fate. When Artavasdes was brought before Octavian, the Roman general looked upon the Armenian king with the cold calculation that had come to define his reign. Octavian had no use for a defeated king. His empire was built not on compassion but on submission. He had already solidified his control over Egypt, and now he sought to eliminate any threat to his newly established reign. Octavian's decision was swift. Artavasdes was executed, and his death was not a quick or merciful one. The Roman emperor knew the power of symbols, and to make an example of Artavasdes was a necessary step in demonstrating Roman authority. Armenia, once a proud and independent kingdom, was now under Roman control. The execution of Artavasdes served as a warning to other kingdoms in the east who dared to defy Rome's growing dominance. The death of Artavasdes marked the end of the Armenian resistance to Roman power. Armenia, once a kingdom that had played a pivotal role in the politics of the Mediterranean, was now reduced to a province of the Roman Empire. The independence that Artavasdes had fought so hard to maintain for his people was lost forever. The kingdom's fate was now tied to the whims of Rome, and the king's death symbolized the collapse of Armenia's once strong resistance to foreign domination. But Artavasdes' legacy was not entirely forgotten. His death, while marking the end of his reign, also served as a poignant reminder of the cost of defiance in a world dominated by imperial power. His story, like that of many who fought against Rome, was one of resistance and ultimately of tragedy. In his pursuit of Armenia's independence, Artavasdes had defied the most powerful empire the world had ever known. And in doing so, he had earned a place in history, albeit a tragic one. For Cleopatra, the death of Artavasdes was another stark reminder of the fragility of political alliances in the ancient world. In her efforts to maintain Egypt's sovereignty, she had formed alliances with powerful men, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and, in turn, Artavasdes. But as history had shown time and again, alliances were only as strong as the political tides that governed them. And in the end, even the most powerful kings and queens could not stand against the unyielding force of Roman ambition. The fall of Artavasdes and the subsequent integration of Armenia into the Roman Empire represented the final phase in the Roman conquest of the East. While Cleopatra had fought valiantly to protect Egypt's independence, her alliances with Antony and Artavasdes had ultimately failed, and Egypt itself fell under Roman control after her death. The political landscape of the Mediterranean was now irrevocably altered, with Rome standing as the undisputed power in the region. The death of Artavasdes, along with the downfall of Cleopatra and Antony, marked the end of an era in the history of the ancient world. The Eastern Mediterranean, once a patchwork of powerful kingdoms and empires, was now dominated by a single, unchallenged empire, Rome. The cost of defiance had been high, and the political repercussions of Artavasdes' capture were felt across the ancient world. But as Rome expanded, it also sowed the seeds of its own eventual downfall, as the empire's unchecked power would eventually lead to its own internal decay and collapse. With the death of Artavasdes II and the consolidation of Roman control over Armenia, the shifting political dynamics of the Mediterranean world reached their inevitable conclusion. Armenia, once a proud and independent kingdom, had been absorbed into the Roman Empire, its sovereignty crushed by the power of Octavian's legions. The fate of Artavasdes and his kingdom, which had once resisted Roman expansion, symbolized the broader collapse of any challenge to Roman supremacy in the East. For Cleopatra, the death of Artavasdes was a symbolic moment, though it was one that came far too late to prevent the fall of Egypt itself. She had fought valiantly to maintain Egypt's independence, aligning herself with powerful Roman figures like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony in an effort to safeguard her kingdom's future. However, the political tide had turned decisively against her, and with Antony's defeat at Actium, Cleopatra had lost her most powerful ally. The death of Artavasdes, once her strategic ally in the region, was merely another casualty of Rome's unyielding drive for domination. In the aftermath of Artavasdes' execution and the fall of Armenia, Cleopatra's position was increasingly precarious. The Egyptian queen, though still holding power in her own kingdom, could no longer rely on the same network of alliances that had once ensured Egypt's independence. Her ties to Antony had made her the target of Octavian's propaganda. And in the wake of their defeat, Cleopatra became the face of Roman opposition. In Rome, Octavian's propaganda machine portrayed Antony and Cleopatra as traitors to Rome, fueling public opinion in favor of their eventual downfall. The political climate had shifted from one of fragile cooperation to one of bitter rivalry and military conquest. Cleopatra's reign, which had once been marked by a strategic alliance with powerful Roman figures, was now seen as a threat to Rome's stability. Cleopatra, though skilled in diplomacy, had miscalculated the political tides that led to her downfall. Her inability to anticipate the rise of Octavian, combined with her refusal to submit to Roman power, had cost her everything. In Alexandria, Cleopatra attempted to retain her power, but she knew her days were numbered. The Roman army, led by Octavian, was fast approaching, and the weight of Rome's power was now crushing any hope for Egypt's survival as an independent state. The people of Egypt, who had once rallied behind Cleopatra as their queen, were now faced with the prospect of Roman rule. For them, the loss of independence was inevitable. The final days of Cleopatra's reign were marked by a sense of inevitability. As Octavian's forces marched toward Alexandria, Cleopatra prepared herself for the worst. She understood that there was little hope for her to avoid the fate that awaited her. She had fought so hard to maintain Egypt's sovereignty. But with the fall of Armenia and her loss of Antony, her kingdom's position was no longer tenable. The fall of Cleopatra was not just the fall of a queen, it was the fall of an entire vision for the Mediterranean world. For Cleopatra, the dream of maintaining an independent Egypt, powerful enough to resist the Roman Empire, had collapsed. Her alliances had failed, her kingdom was crumbling, and her world was rapidly disintegrating. The romanticized image of Cleopatra, the queen who had once seduced the greatest men of Rome, had been replaced by the image of a defeated ruler, awaiting the inevitable end of her reign. When Octavian's forces finally arrived in Alexandria, Cleopatra, despite her defeat, held fast to her dignity. She refused to be paraded in chains through the streets of Rome as a symbol of Roman triumph. As the Roman army closed in, Cleopatra made a fateful decision to end her life rather than succumb to the humiliation of capture. It is believed that she committed suicide, along with her loyal attendants, using the venom of an asp or another poison. The death of Cleopatra marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the final chapter of Egypt's independence. Her death was a tragic, poignant conclusion to a reign that had been both remarkable and fraught with political peril. Cleopatra, who had once ruled with ambition and intelligence, was now gone, and Egypt's fate was sealed. With her passing, Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire, and its once glorious kingdom was reduced to a mere province under Roman rule. Octavian, now Augustus, emerged as the sole ruler of the Roman world, with Egypt firmly under his control, while the fall of Cleopatra and the death of Artavasdes marked the end of an era. The consequences of their downfall were felt far beyond the borders of their kingdoms. The collapse of Armenia, Egypt, and their respective resistances to Roman expansion heralded the final consolidation of Roman power in the Mediterranean. The Roman Empire, now under the control of Augustus, stretched across vast territories, from the British Isles to the deserts of Egypt. The dream of an independent East, where kingdoms like Armenia and Egypt could hold their own against the Roman colossus, had been shattered. For the people of Armenia, the loss of their king and the subsequent Roman conquest was a bitter pill to swallow. Once proud of their sovereignty and their resistance to outside forces, the Armenians now found themselves under the direct control of the Roman Empire. The cultural and political identity of Armenia would never be the same. and the influence of the ancient kingdom would be relegated to the past. The fate of Armenia, like that of Egypt, was sealed by the iron grip of Rome, while the kingdom would continue to exist as a province under Roman rule. Its independence was forever lost. For Artavasdes, the last hope of Armenia's autonomy had been extinguished, and with it, the legacy of a kingdom that had once stood strong against the forces of the great empires. For Cleopatra, the price of her ambition had been the fall of her kingdom. Her alliances, her political maneuverings, and her relationships with powerful Roman figures had all come to nothing in the end. The ultimate victory of Octavian was not just a victory over Antony and Cleopatra, but over the vision of a Mediterranean world where the might of Rome could be challenged. The end of Cleopatra's reign and the collapse of Armenia served as a stark reminder of the unyielding force of Roman imperialism. But even in defeat, Cleopatra's legacy lived on. Her story, one of ambition, intelligence, and tragic downfall, became legend. She would forever be remembered as one of the most powerful women in history, whose alliances and struggles shaped the course of the ancient world. Her death, though the end of Egypt's sovereignty, was also the beginning of her myth, one that would be told and retold for generations to come. The ancient world, vast and complex, was shaped by the ambitions, victories, and failures of kings and queens, generals and rulers, whose fates were often decided by shifting alliances and the whims of power. The downfall of Artavasdes II, the tragic end of Cleopatra, and the fall of the independent kingdoms of Armenia and Egypt marked the conclusion of an era in which great civilizations struggled to assert their sovereignty in the face of the unstoppable rise of the Roman Empire. With the death of Cleopatra and the execution of Artavasdes, the Mediterranean world had entered a new age, one defined by Roman dominance, where the dream of an independent East, capable of challenging Rome, had faded into the past. But as with all great stories of power, the legacies of those who fell in this struggle did not simply vanish with their deaths. History, while written by the victors, is also remembered through the tales of those who resisted, those who fought for their kingdoms, their people, and their vision of the world. And in this sense, the legacies of Artavasdes and Cleopatra, though entwined in tragedy, continue to resonate through the annals of history. Cleopatra's life and reign were marked by her brilliance, her charm, and her remarkable political acumen. She had been a queen who ruled with immense intellect and passion, a ruler who understood the intricacies of Roman politics and used her alliances with powerful figures like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony to secure Egypt's place in the world. Yet, despite her talents and determination, Cleopatra's downfall came because of her inability to navigate the shifting tides of Roman power. In the end, she was a woman whose life and death served as a symbol of both the glory and the fragility of the great powers of the ancient world. Her legacy is not just one of romance and intrigue, it is a legacy of a queen who fought fiercely to protect her kingdom and preserve its independence in a world where power was shifting from regional kingdoms to an all-encompassing empire. Her ability to leverage her alliances, her intellect, and her political vision was extraordinary. Though she ultimately failed to preserve Egypt's sovereignty, she remains one of the most iconic figures in history, remembered not only for her beauty but for her strength as a leader. Similarly, Artavasdes II, the King of Armenia, became a tragic figure in the broader narrative of resistance against Rome. His kingdom, once powerful and independent, stood as a bulwark against Roman expansion. But despite his best efforts, Artavasdes could not withstand the weight of Rome's relentless growth. His death, at the hands of the very empire he had long sought to resist, served as a reminder of the futility of fighting against the inevitable tide of Roman conquest. Armenia, once a significant player in the political game of the ancient world, was reduced to a mere province, its legacy diminished by the overwhelming power of Rome. Yet Artavasdes' resistance was not without meaning. His reign, his diplomacy, and his alliances, particularly with Cleopatra, marked a period in which Armenia fought for its independence against greater powers. While his eventual betrayal and death sealed Armenia's fate, his story speaks to the eternal struggle for sovereignty in the face of imperialism. Though Armenia was no longer independent, its story remained a testament to the courage and resolve of a king who believed in the right of his people to determine their own future, no matter the cost. In the final analysis, the downfall of Artavasdes and Cleopatra was not merely the end of two rulers, but the end of an era. Their death signaled the final consolidation of Roman power over the Mediterranean, the last gasp of independent kingdoms and empires that had once shaped the region's destiny. With the fall of Egypt and Armenia, Rome's empire grew stronger, its influence over the known world undeniable. Octavian, later Augustus, became the first emperor of Rome, and the Roman Empire ushered in an age of unparalleled dominance that would last for centuries. However, the consequences of Cleopatra's death and Artavasdes' fall extended far beyond the borders of their kingdoms. They left a profound impact on the history of the Mediterranean and the legacy of resistance against imperial control. Even in their defeat, they had become symbols of the will to preserve power and independence, of rulers who fought for their kingdoms in the face of overwhelming odds. For future generations, the story of Artavasdes II and Cleopatra would serve as a powerful reminder of the complexities of power, the fragility of alliances, and the tragic cost of defiance against a rapidly expanding empire. It would also be a lesson in the fleeting nature of political power, as even the mightiest rulers could be swept away by the forces they had tried to control. Though their kingdoms may have fallen, their stories lived on, carried through history by the tales of their ambition, their struggles, and their ultimate sacrifices. Artavasdes, a king whose bravery was eclipsed by Rome's might, and Cleopatra, a queen whose beauty and intelligence were matched only by her determination to protect her kingdom, were not simply defeated, they were immortalized by their lives and their legacies. The Mediterranean world that followed their downfall would be one of Roman dominance. But the echoes of Artavasdes and Cleopatra's reigns would continue to resonate through the ages. Their stories remind us that, in the face of insurmountable odds, even the most powerful rulers cannot escape the tides of history. The fall of Armenia and Egypt, though painful, was but one chapter in the ever-changing narrative of the ancient world, one that would continue to unfold as the Roman Empire expanded and eventually collapsed under the weight of its own ambitions. In the end, the legacy of Artavasdes II and Cleopatra VII lives on, not just as a cautionary tale of the dangers of imperial expansion, but as a tribute to the rulers who dared to challenge it.